found as I started exploring more of the injuries in special populations, kind of vulnerable groups, was how closely that intertwined with trauma. And in fact, a recent meta-analysis done on the DSM has been quite scathing, and because it doesn't take into account how trauma affects embodied experience, these DSM diagnoses. And so it's an interesting time right now as we begin to look at how people occupy their bodies, and that maybe it's not as cut and dried, and maybe the scope of practice and the mechanisms that we have for addressing different health concerns are not as clear cut as we'd like to think they are. And there's room to explore those connections. And so having some understanding about how kind of mental health and physical health affect each other, even just at a very basic level, will help us to be more adaptive. And that's what I've been doing for the past 5 or 6 years is in designing the Reembody method, is looking at just how do humans occupy space? How do we move our bodies through space? And what are the factors that seem to be the biggest players in why we do it the way we do? And I'll tell you, the short answer is threat. Our level of threat is the chief dictator about how we organize our bodies in space. So we're going to take a quick look at some of the basic mechanics of this. And I've got a couple slides I'm going to show you. Full disclosure, I'm not really a slide guy. I really like presenting. I really like speaking in front of people. And I'm going to do my very best to stay kind of like on course with the slides I produce, but no promises. Also, I'm more interested in knowing what you guys need to know than in having some kind of perfect presentation. So please don't hesitate to toss out questions or explore an idea in the moment. That's way more what I'm interested in. Does that make sense to everybody? Okay. All right. Excellent. Here we go. So I'm going to share my screen. Boom, boom, boom. There we go. All right, can everybody see that okay? All right, so we're looking at threat response, and I'm going to try to gear my conversation, of course, mostly toward the massage setting. A Reembody session includes some manual manipulation like a massage session, but also includes a fair bit of talking and coaching and other things. But as much as I can, I've tried to narrow our scope today to really what is going to matter to people who are in a touch, maybe even a non-verbal touch environment like a massage practice. So the first thing we're going to look at is essentially the polyvagal system. Just raise your hand real quick if you've ever heard the term polyvagal theory or polyvagal system. Is that a familiar term for people? Yeah, there's a ton of great work been done around this, and it helps bring some understanding of physiology into things like fight or flight, right? We all are aware of the fight or flight system, right? That's a very culturally accepted term, but there's a physiology behind it that actually is trackable and measurable, and it's this polyvagal system. So this image I have here just gives you just a quick sense of this is what we mean when we talk about the vagus nerve, the polyvagal system, right? This is where the brain and the gut connect to each other. And that's essentially all we mean when we're talking about our threat response system, right? This polyvagal system kind of decides where, which mechanisms get switched on and which ones get switched off. Oops. There we go. So, we're going to look at this in the context of two factors. One is we're going to call arousal. Arousal just being from a state of relative calm at the low arousal area to a state of excitation at the high arousal area. And then we're going to compare arousal with security. How secure do we feel? Low security is another way of saying very threatened. And of course, high security, we're okay, we're doing all right. And so if we just take a look at what some of these things mean, you'll notice that the social engagement box right in the middle there is is right in the middle there, because healthy human social engagement does include a certain amount of needing to get your needs met, not having all your needs met all at once, not being totally secure, you know, not being super excited, but also not being fully at rest. There is this kind of comfortable middle ground where humans really thrive. And in most kind of polyvagal discussions, this is described as safe and social, or social engagement, or social wellness, or whatever. But humans as social creatures are, when we are at our most effective, is in this middle ground. Now, oops. Now, this obviously changes as our environment changes. So what we all kind of hope for is that as our environment becomes more demanding, or our need for something becomes a little bit more demanding, we can shift into what's called a sympathetic nervous system state. This is fight or flight, right? This is where my resources are low, or there's a resource that I need, or I feel threatened in some way. And so I need to up the stakes a little bit in order to get that need met. And that's very okay, right? We have not yet entered the realm of trauma, right? This is just what humans do when they need to get their needs met. Their sympathetic nervous system lights up and they find a way to get done what they need to get done. And we'll explore more about what that looks like exactly in a moment. And then again, our hope is that once we elevate to that sympathetic state, we can get our needs met and all is fine and well. And at that point, our arousal can drop back down. We can be very secure because we got our needs met, and we can go into restoration. And obviously we rest and recover at that moment, process whatever happened to us in our sympathetic nervous system state. And then eventually after rest and recovery, we can return back to that lovely middle ground. Now, unfortunately, that is not always what happens. And occasionally our sympathetic nervous system position leads us to shutdown. Now, shutdown is interesting because it's very similar to restoration in that it is a low arousal state, right? What our body learns in shutdown, as we enter shutdown, is that our excitations that we attempted to employ to get our needs met didn't work. And we need to move on to the next phase. So some people will call this shutdown phase a kind of like reconnaissance phase. We shut down and we stay still and we attenuate to figure out what's my next move. Shutdown, also called freeze, is also sometimes related to the idea of playing dead, right? That if I couldn't overcome the threat, if I just lie real still, maybe the threat will ignore me. It's a kind of last-ditch effort. It's not a pretty place to be. So when we talk about a traumatized person, or someone who's experienced trauma, capital T, we are mostly referring to somebody who has at some point needed to enter a shutdown state, right? If we're just toggling between sympathetic and restoration from time to time, that's just challenge. Like that may suck, but it's okay. But if we are pushed into a shutdown phase, kind of even just one time, or worse yet, lots of little times, now we're starting to talk about what we collectively understand to be trauma. Okay, so I'm going to pause here just for a second. Is this making sense to everybody? Does anybody have any initial questions about this process or this system they'd like to explore? Okay, looks like everybody, I don't see any raised hands, so I'm going to assume we're all good. All right, so moving on. Now, it is this shift from sympathetic nervous system to shutdown that is of interest to us right now, right? Because a very interesting thing happens when we go from sympathetic to shutdown. Now, we're gonna gloss over it a little bit today, and then in our next event, we're gonna talk a lot more about the specific mechanics of this, because this is where Reembody has done a lot of its work. But remember that in the sympathetic nervous system state, you were excited, right? Your blood pressure was up, your heart rate was elevated. You were releasing glucose and fat tissue into energy, usable energy for your muscles. You were ready to get busy. But then something about the threat shifted so that you suddenly realized, or part of your brain realized, uh-oh, all that excitation is not only not going to fix this problem, it might actually put me in more risk. And so part of you has to figure out how to shut down the other part, right? So it's in between these two things, your somatic nervous system and its excitations actually become threats. It's no longer just the environmental threat that you were fighting against. Your own response to that threat is now a secondary villain that you've got to find a way to shut down. And this terminology and this kind of model of this, I think, is a very important thing for wellness practitioners to start taking on board. That it's not as simple as just addressing the threat. If it was as simple as addressing the external threat, then when it was over, we'd be fine. But we're not fine when it's over, because we remain concerned about our SNS reactions in the moment of excitation and how we shut them down. Okay, cool. All right, so moving on. So SNS becomes threatening because the sympathetic nervous system is part of it. The autonomic nervous system is separated into these two parts, sympathetic and parasympathetic. Now, shutdown and restoration are both part of the parasympathetic system. And we tend to think of parasympathetic as being like, that's where we want to return to, right? We tend to think of, I'm stressed or I'm traumatized or I'm upset, therefore I'm sympathetic, and I want to be able to drop back down to parasympathetic, but it's not that simple, because shutdown is also parasympathetic, and it's not a nice place to be. But when we get into that place where we're trending that direction, the sympathetic nervous system and the parasympathetic nervous system have to kind of duke it out. They've got to be able, those systems, it's not this easy transition from one to the other. There's a constant calculus taking place where the brain is saying, how threatened are we? Is it more threatening to stay still? Is it more threatening to move? How do we know? How do we know what kind of movements to do? And there's a cascade of chemical thresholds, neurotransmitter thresholds, and mechanical actions, which we'll look at here in a second, which are mediating all of this. So it's really an inner battle between sympathetic and parasympathetic nervous system and their neurotransmitter responses. So this is where things get really interesting, because the sympathetic nervous system causes a lot of interesting stuff to happen to your body. And so this list I have here is not by any means comprehensive. It's a good list, right? There's a lot of major stuff that happens here, but I want you just to glance over this list real quick and familiarize yourself with some of these things. These are the evidence of a sympathetic nervous system state, an excited state. Now, for our purposes, when we're talking about, having a client come in who has been traumatized, has experienced trauma, or is currently embodying trauma, they have gone through these things, but they're probably not in these states right now. I show you this list because there's something very special about what we're looking at here, and that is that all of these things feel like something. All of these things feel like something. So when all of this stuff happens, this is not just stuff that happens. You can be aware of all of the visceral sensations that go along with these things. And let's actually talk about this real quick. I find that in my work, it's very useful to be able to, in fact, you know what? I'm going to stop the screen share just for a minute and kind of come back to, there we go, just looking at each other. In my own work, I find that it is extremely useful to be able to separate sensation, the sensations that people are having, between visceral sensation and then what I choose to sum up as musculoskeletal sensation. So musculoskeletal sensation would be anything that you might feel your muscles doing, right? So that would be effort, fatigue, stretch, something like that. Also impulse to action, right? So if you've ever had a client that really feels like they want to run from the room, or they feel like they need to lay down, that kind of impulse to action, I also group that under musculoskeletal sensation. And then there's visceral sensation, which is typically stuff that happens in your organs, right? Heart, lungs, stomach, intestines. But included in that would be mouth, throat, skin. And these things are not processed the same way. Musculoskeletal sensation and visceral sensation are processed differently. And what's really interesting, and we're not going to talk much about pain today, because obviously that's one of the kind of glaring sensations that really notifies us of trauma is pain. Pain is way more complicated, and we'll talk about that next time. But musculoskeletal sensation is often a sign or is part of the system that is masking visceral sensation.
Say that again.
So a strong impulse to action, or a huge amount of fatigue, or a fixation on the effort that you feel in a muscle, and when we get to it later, pain. Pain is part of this. These things are how the body can distract you or compartmentalize or dissociate from your visceral sensations. Right? So this is what I'm talking about when I talk about the visceral sensation can be the new threat. And so the body's got to figure out, how do I manage that threat? And it turns out it can use the musculoskeletal system to do that, to compartmentalize, to dissociate, to manage the flow of force. It looks like Rosa has a question. Rosa, I'm going to unmute you. Yeah, go ahead.
So when you're talking about all of this, I am thinking panic attack.
Okay, let's talk about panic attacks. I love talking about panic attacks. So yeah, raise your hand if you ever heard the term catastrophic thinking. Anybody familiar with catastrophic thinking? Okay, so consider this. Let's say I'm in a state where my visceral sensations, right? I've already slid from sympathetic to shutdown state. And so my visceral excitations, I have tagged unconsciously as being threatening. Now, that's all fine and well, but all of that sympathetic nervous system state generates a resource, right? It's not like I stopped feeling scared. It's not like I stopped feeling angry. I just had to distance myself from it for my sense of safety. And so this works for a short period of time. But Rosa, if someone is in that state for a long, long time, the energy it takes to suppress or to compartmentalize starts to get bigger than the threat of feeling the thing. And so there are two things that can happen. One version of this is catastrophic thinking, where the brain starts to manufacture thoughts that will make you feel afraid. And ironically, what do we always do when we start having these catastrophic thinking? We're always told to kind of like focus on something else, try to calm down, convince yourself it's not real, blah, 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 blah. But that just kicks the can down the road, right? The brain just comes up with a new thought that's even scarier, right? And so panic attacks are essentially a threshold moment where the nervous system says, no, it's actually more important for me to garner the resource associated with fear, with my excitation, than it is to not feel it for safety.
We had a question from Tina.
Yep.
Who wants to know, are you talking about visceral sensations being the feelings a person is having?
Yes, and we're going to explore that a little bit more in a minute, Tina. But yes, visceral sensation is essentially real-time sensation in the organs of the body. And then Akemi, I see that you have raised your hand. I'm going to unmute you. Go right ahead.
So my question, like regarding the panic attack and a mental catastrophic thinking, can and does that manifest on the table in terms of a bodily reaction of a numbing, where the client has an inability to identify. I don't know, I can't tell, maybe that feels, it's just all over.
Absolutely, 100%. And in fact, what we're going to explore here in a little bit, when we get back to the slideshow here in a moment, is yeah, for what you guys are doing with people as massage therapists, really, in a way, you're kind of lending them your nervous system in order to feel their body, right? If we've got, especially if we're talking about just the traumatized client, they have likely dissociated as part of their traumatizing experience, and they know on some level that they need to feel their body, but they can't do it alone. They need a surrogate to feel their body. And so starting from a position of numbing, right, that's a very common place to find somebody when they begin this process. Absolutely. All right, so I'm going to jump back into the slideshow here. Zara, will you keep kind of monitoring questions for me?
Yep.
Thank you.
Actually, a quick point of order.
Yep.
I can be seen while I'm talking. Hi. So a couple things. If you want to ask a question, please jump in. A couple ways to do that is if you click on participants at the bottom end of your screen, you'll find your name. There should be a little place where you can raise your hand down there. It may vary based on the kind of computer you're running, but that's the way it works for most of us. Another way to do that is through the chat box, which is also down there by participants. Type in your questions and Kevin or I will get to them. Okay, carry on.
Yeah. And if you want to ask your question out loud, raising your hand is the best thing. If you would rather Zara or I read it for you, use the chat bubble.
And we can make it anonymous if you'd like to specify that.
Absolutely. Okay, so I'm going to go back to a screen share. Boom, there we go. Everybody can see that all right?
Yeah.
Excellent. And here we go. Okay, so as I was saying, we have all of these things that happen in our excited state, and they all feel like something. And we may have figured out that all of these things that feel like something are themselves threats. And so depending on whatever our experience may have been, we have had to create selective dissociation, selective compartmentalization of these experiences. And this is where we start, when we say that, like, oh, well, different people experience trauma different ways. This is where the rubber meets the road. What we mean is people selectively distance themselves from different feelings depending on whatever was tagged as dangerous in their experience. For some people, the thing that gets tagged as dangerous might be an anger response, right? Might be, you know, the heat rising in the face and the pressure in the cheeks when we get mad. For other people, it might be the sweating. As they begin to sweat from fear, their nervous system has tagged that as being, oh, I can't show that. That's too dangerous. So I need to distance myself from that. So at the root level, what people are doing when they shift from sympathetic to shutdown is always the same, right? The process is the same, no matter who we are, demographically, culturally, age, everything. But the specific things that we distance ourselves from can shift from person to person. And this is, you know, again, as you know, we are gearing this course today towards a kind of cultural competency angle. And this is one of the ways that we can be effective at working with a diversity of people, is by understanding that whatever it is I happen to be demographically distancing myself from as part of my inner threat, the system that led me to do that is the same as yours, no matter who I am, no matter who you are. And so we can always come back to some of these common things, these common body experiences that can form the vocabulary of our work with people. So, again, it would be nice if, having experienced a traumatic event that led me to shutdown, it would be great if I could just slide myself right on over to restoration, right? If I could go straight from low arousal, low security, and just climb right up the security chain and just feel better. But in my experience and study, that's not how it works. We have to take a trip back to sympathetic first before we can go anywhere new. Because again, remember, the kind of the thesis statement of this talk today is that our own sympathetic nervous system became the threat. So we've got to be able to go back to our sympathetic nervous system excitations and say, it's okay for me to feel that way. It's not dangerous for me to feel that way. It's acceptable for this part of my body to be part of my body. And this can be a tricky path to walk, right? Lots of wellness modalities try to do it in lots of different ways. And you guys have a particular skill set in being able to have a body on the table that's a body that you can be compassionate with, that you can be non-judgmental toward, that you can both touch and interact with in a compassionate way. And I just want to kind of plant the seed here today that what you are specifically doing at that moment with your traumatized client is either verbally or non-verbally telling them that whatever they had to distance themselves from to enter shutdown, you are welcoming here in your space. After that, we can go back to our beautiful little loop of restoration to social engagement. But where wellness modalities falter and where they start getting results that are mixed across populations is when we try to rush going from the red box to the blue box. Because that only addresses the external threat. It doesn't address the internal threat. And for some people, that's all that's left. That's all that's left.
It assumes a consistent low arousal.
That's right. So in your space, when we're working with traumatized people, there's one thesis that we're trying to present, that it is safe to feel. We can't do anything about the environmental threat that they may have originally faced. Whatever the traumatizing experience or experiences were is very relevant to them, but to our therapeutic space is less relevant. The detail, because that's wrapped up in subjectivity. This is what happened to me. It is specific to me and what my life experiences have been like, and my demographics, and my culture, and my everything else. But my internal threat, the way it feels in my body, that's where there's commonality. And we can accept just about anything coming from a body. Trying to unpack someone's culturally specific trauma, that is hard to do, even for the people for people for whom that is their job. That's a hard job. But for a kind of a therapeutic wellness space, we can do so much good by just imparting this one idea. It is safe to feel. And then one little caveat I want to offer to this, though, is that frequently in a traumatized client, what we'll call the inciting incident or incidents, right? The actual incident of trauma may be something in the past and is no longer, that external threat is not technically present anymore. However, it might be. You may find yourself with clients, traumatized clients, and the source of that traumatizing experience might still be true, right? They might have a situation at home, which they're going to go back to after your session. And one of the things that we want to be careful with this "it is safe to feel" statement is that we are saying it is specifically safe to feel here. We don't want to push too far into the "it's safe to feel always," because maybe it isn't, right? This system happens for a reason. And it's a good system. It's a beautiful system. It keeps us safe. Does everybody understand the distinction here and why I think this distinction is important? Any questions about that? Okay. So let's see here. What time do we have right now? It is 10:30. Okay, excellent. So real quick, let's just go. Boom. I've got a couple things here in the chat box that I want to explore and a couple little places here. So from Liz, Liz says, what does harassing the sensations mean? Liz, I'm going to unmute you. Oops, I'm going to try. Yeah, there we go. Liz, I have unmuted you. Can you explain?
Harnessing. That was a typo. You at one point, and it's so far back now, I don't know if I can get back to it, but you said something about harnessing the sensations. Trying to remember. Can you hear me?
I can hear you. Yep.
Okay, great. Yeah. This was so far back. I'm looking at my notes. I think it was somewhere around, hang on. Honestly, I can't remember where we were now because I wrote that a while back.
Okay.
Um,
All right. Well, how about this? We can come back to it if you think of it. How about that?
okay, yeah.
All right. All right. And there were a few other things in the chat here. Can you talk about shaking and crying during massage? Oh, I would love to. All right. So how about this? Just by a quick show of hands, have you ever seen a client have an emotional reaction on the table? But all the hands go up. Yeah, really common, really common. And this really gets to exactly what I'm talking about, right? Because first of all, let's talk specifically about shaking. Shaking is an amazing process. We could do a whole webinar type experience just on shaking. There's been a lot of interesting research done about how shaking seems to be a very integral part of how we shift from parasympathetic to sympathetic nervous system responses in both directions. And that shaking is in fact extremely therapeutic. What's more, it doesn't even necessarily have to come on organically, that we can kind of produce shaking kind of artificially and stimulate a lot of the same activity that organic shaking causes when it happens automatically, which is very cool. And so one of the things that I know is true is when we see people having emotional reactions, in particular when they are, I'm going to use the word violent, but I don't mean violent as in like offensive, but seeing someone begin to shake, and sometimes shaking isn't just like little shivers, it's like quaking. Has anyone ever seen that? Anyone ever seen quaking?
Done that.
Yeah. Quaking can be disconcerting, right? It can, especially if you are the wellness practitioner who is kind of overseeing this client's care for the moment, it can bring up feelings like, oh shit, what have I done, right? And one of the things that with shaking in particular, that I definitely want people to know is that this is normal. If you are in a situation where you are providing feeling, physical feeling for a person who may not have a lot of it, you are facilitating a switch between a parasympathetic and a sympathetic nervous system response. And guys, here's the thing. You don't actually know which direction they're going yet, right? You may be facilitating a switch from sympathetic to parasympathetic, like a restoration shift. That's true. I think that's what we mostly think of, right? When we think of ourselves as providers of massage, we think a person comes in stressed, we massage them and they calm down. And that can be true, absolutely. But in the case of the traumatized client, what you might be seeing is a person in shutdown that you are allowing to feel back into a sympathetic state. And that may be what that shaking is all about. And in particular, when it comes with crying, whimpering, rapid changes in body temperature, sweating, etc., all that stuff might signal a return to the sympathetic process. And that would be wonderful. You would be doing them a very important service if that's what was taking place. So shaking and crying, I'm going to separate them out just a little bit, because with shaking, if you see shaking start, brilliant. Keep doing exactly what you're doing, right? There's no need to change much with a shake. And actually, I feel like Stephanie wanted to get it. Stephanie, did you have something?
Yes.
Yeah, go ahead.
I just, because I think in the current environment, we're all a little virus spooked a little bit. I just wondered if there's any clinical way to distinguish between what we're talking about here in terms of shaking or quaking and rigors, which can also be symptomatic of the body trying to initiate a fever, because I've seen that as well, not in my practice, but in my mother. You know, no fever, massive abscess going on in her body. This was prior to all of what's going on right now. But as we're talking about this shaking response, they look exactly the same. I've seen both. And they look very similar. And so I'm just wondering, is there any distinction?
So from a physiological, like with the naked eye standpoint, not really. Okay. But here's a way to navigate that, because you're right. This is a sensitive topic at the moment. And first of all, your intake form, right? When this person comes in, it's you know something about them. And certainly including in your intake form or your kind of initial conversation with the client, your intake conversation, adding some pieces that might tell you whether or not they are high risk for some kind of a viral or bacterial infection could be, you know, like for instance, do you currently have any lesions? You know, any bodily lesions, or you know, when was the last time you were checked for a fever, or when was the last contact you had with a, you know, it's not foolproof, but having some of those other data points can help you to make smarter navigation decisions about that situation. Because yeah, you're absolutely right. The risk is there that if someone is shaking and sweating, they might be simply having a sympathetic nervous system response, or they might be sick and the body is initiating fever. It is only those additional data points are going to help you suss that out, because it's not.
So there's nothing visually that would help you.
In the body's presentation, those things are not different.
Okay, thank you.
Becky Mattis had a question?
Let's see. Yeah, Becky, I'm going to unmute you. I'm going to try. Hold on. There we go. Becky, go right ahead.
I didn't have a question. Actually, I just had a question.
Like your hand, I'll lower the hand. No worries there. Okay, Becky's good. Jesse, I see your hand is up. Did you have a question?
Yes, I did. Hello.
Hello.
So what was my question? I'm sorry. I guess I've been on either side of the table with this response in particular. I've had body work when I've been working on processing trauma, and I've had shaking and crying while I was a recipient of massage. And I've also had clients that have done it. So I come from a little bit of a perspective where I'm aware of what's happening. I guess for me as a client, I found that it was really beneficial to have the therapist reinforce that it was a safe response.
Yes.
And to reinforce that, hey, this is okay, you're safe to release these emotions. So that was hugely beneficial for my personal experience. And I find that I will tend to, my compassion level for other people will rise when I start to see that response occurring for others. And whether that's the tone of my voice, or checking in with them, or any of those types of things. So I just kind of wondered what your perspective was on an approach to that, for one, and then to piggyback off of the woman's question just before mine. It seems to me that the onset of these responses, although these physical responses are the same, whether the body's trying to combat a virus or a tumor or something like that, as it, you know, that response might be the same, but I think the onset might appear different. And if we are trying to be a little bit more aware of that person, physical aside, and just taking the person emotionally into account, it might give us some more cues as well as to whether or not that is straight up a physical response to the body trying to beat an illness, or if it's an emotional trauma response. So I just kind of wanted to chime in on that and see what your thoughts were.
Okay, excellent, thank you. So I'll address the first, we'll talk to the first thing first. Hold on just a second here. Okay, there we go. Yeah, when someone is having an emotional response, and let's assume now a client who is going from a shutdown parasympathetic state back to a sympathetic state momentarily on the table. And they start to have a physiological emotional experience, right? They shake, they cry, their body temperature rapidly fluctuates, etc. I find that there are two kind of broad umbrella reactions that I try to present to those moments. The first I would call simply sympathy. Now, obviously, you may be working with a client who, has specified that they don't want verbal interaction or they do want verbal interaction, and so you get to kind of navigate how nonverbal or verbal that is. But sympathy, right? And I find this particularly works when someone's having a reaction that I can identify with, right? As the last question just said, I've felt that, I've shook and cried on the table. So if someone begins to shake and cry and I immediately feel in myself, oh, I know what that feels like, then an expression of sympathy, be it a verbal one or a nonverbal one, would be great. I find another one that really helps is curiosity. Curiosity. Because what many traumatized people, what people in general are accustomed to is that when they feel things strongly, we tend to want to fix it. When people feel things strongly, often the first reaction of most people we encounter is to quickly mitigate that strong feeling. Does everybody know what I'm talking about here? Raise your hand if this sounds familiar to you, right? And there is this interesting kind of belief we have in the modern world that if we let a big feeling happen, that it won't stop. That we have to somehow make big feelings get smaller, otherwise they stay big forever, when this is absolutely not the case. A big feeling comes up, the neurotransmitters that sustain it get processed, and then it dips back down again all on its own, the vast majority of the time. And so curiosity, I find, is a great bulwark against fixing. I don't have any intention with this feeling. I want to know more about it. So asking the client questions about their experience, that if you can see them having an experience, asking them questions about it, or even in your touch, right? Even in your touch practice, moving your touch in a way because you want to know more about what they're experiencing. Even if you don't say it, they can feel that. Curiosity about an experience, I have found, is a very powerful wellness framework. But yeah, if your client is open to verbal interaction, or if you're comfortable with verbal interaction, I definitely recommend acknowledging what's happening. Don't let it happen in secret, because that makes everybody feel weird, right? Let it be happening in the open. Yeah. And let's see, there was another one here.
Yeah, I just wanted to jump in. I think the odds of seeing someone on your table soon, hopefully soon, who is experiencing some aftermath of trauma, some recent aftermath of trauma, is extremely high. And I would posit that it's going to feel different, both to you and to them, as you go back to practice. So I'd be curious, as we move forward and move back into our lives eventually, what will you notice? What are you anticipating in your own body, for one, and then what will you be sensing in your client going forward?
Actually, and that's an excellent point that I do want to bring up here. We're going to explore this more in the next event, but since it's here, I'll plant the seed now. Your practitioners' emotional reactions to the therapeutic moment are not immaterial. right? So obviously someone else has paid you for this therapeutic space that you're holding, and you have a responsibility to them. However, the way that you feel about the session and the way that you feel about the client happens. It happens and it changes you whether you want it to or not sometimes. And so it is important to be able to have what I'm going to call a pause between recognizing your own feeling, your own physiological feeling, more about that later, and still being able to provide your hold therapeutic space. You don't have to shut down in order to provide therapeutic space. You might temporarily compartmentalize, but that's different than ignoring. Does that make sense to everybody? Right? And I love that Azar brought this up. When you return to massage eventually, to actually touching strangers daily again, you may find that some stuff comes up, right? And let's not pretend like everything is going to just be normal, right? Let's not willingly dissociate if we can have a pause, a safe pause.
I'm making a comment in the chat box right now about some search terms you might want to look into. This is big in the field of clinical psychology. The notion that when you're dealing with a client who reminds you of your dad, you're going to treat them like your dad, whether you mean to or not. Those kind of ghosts sort of live within all of us. And likewise, if the client looks at you and you look like someone that they've lost or someone that they've had problems with in the past, you can expect some resistance there as well. And I imagine massage is no different. I'm not a massage therapist, of course, but there's that kind of intimacy that comes with being in the same room with somebody. Forget about even touching them. You bring your own baggage and you take some of theirs, the same process. So transference and countertransference are the terms to look into if you want to learn more about this stuff.
You know, I think again we love to this term scope of practice, right? Raise your hand if you've ever had discussions around scope of practice before, right? This is one of my least favorite terms in the wellness community because it assumes that there are these barriers between mental and physical health, and there are these barriers between touch and verbal coaching. But these are completely arbitrary and of our own making. Now, obviously, there's law behind these arbitrary things, and so we have to at least be aware of them. But kind of what we're playing with here a little bit is that we can be aware of them, we can adhere to our scope of practice while not being fooled by it, right? Let's not pretend like that scope of practice actually means anything other than a legal boundary. It is not a physiological boundary. And that's important for us to understand. All right, so we are at 10:50, so here's what I want to do. We're going to take a quick 9-minute break just to kind of digest a little bit, and then we're going to come back and dive into a few more pieces. So, get a drink of water, stretch a little bit, process the information quietly on your own for a moment, and of course, if you have any questions, write them down, and just kind of leave your screen open, and we'll be back at 11 o'clock. Everybody cool with that? Okay, excellent. All right, so we are back. It's 11 o'clock now. Would everyone just raise their hand, let everybody know they can hear me and that we're good here? Yep, all right, fantastic.
Now we have the truck going by.
Yeah, the garbage truck is going by, so just give me one moment here. Perfect, all right, excellent. Okay, so first of all, with a few minutes to kind of rest and digest, that's another polyvagal term, by the way, has any other questions about the material we've covered so far? I see a couple things in the chat window here. So how about this? If you have something that you've thought of that you'd like to bring up before we get back into the new stuff, please either raise your hand or put it in the chat. Let's see what we have here. So I described the nervous system moving from shutdown to sympathetic as part of a therapeutic progression. It seems to me the same pathway would also happen in re-traumatization, a situation we should avoid. That is absolutely true. So here's where things get a little tricky, because there is this concept of re-traumatization, right? We don't want to relive a trauma. We don't want to provide a space where the goal is to relive the trauma. And I find that the easiest way to avoid that, again, because for many of you, you might be counselors, I don't know, but you are massage therapists. And it is a particular kind of training that goes into being with people in a social, in particular verbal context, where you're helping them navigate a sympathetic nervous system reaction. And if that's not something that you have been through or not something that you feel ready to take on, then the way to be with that is to be with physiological sensation. One of the things that can be very tricky, and we'll talk about this more in a moment, is that a traumatized client for whom feeling is unsafe will often package their experience in narrative, right? All humans we have the thing that we feel, and then we have the story we tell about it. That's all experience for every human ever. And both of those things are equally valid. But if the feeling part recently got really scary, sorry, one second. If the feeling part recently got really scary, the only thing we might have left is the story that we tell, the sense that we make of it. And what we want to be cautious of is if a person starts to feel something and then immediately tries to escape from that with a story, trying to engage you in the story, that's where I find the waters can get muddy and the danger of re-traumatization comes up. If we can stay with feeling, which again is what you guys excel at already, right? Feeling bodies is what you're really, really good at. And the more that we can kind of acknowledge if someone has a story they want to tell, but continue to kind of set the space that we're in as being a space that's more about being in our bodies than it is about telling stories. There's places to tell stories. Maybe that's not right here. It's a fine line to walk. You'll get no argument from me there. However, in my experience, if I have to err, I'm going to err on the side of it being safe to feel. I don't want to be the one that says it's not okay for you to feel what you're feeling here. That's not a place I'm terribly comfortable. Does that make sense? But yeah, definitely, as we start to explore this next phase of the world, as the world comes back together, where there is going to probably be more of this kind of traumatized embodiment in the wellness community, both among practitioners and our clients, seeking out a little extra help for what to do in situations where the trauma we're not really sure how to navigate this could be very useful. Let's see, what else did we have? At some point, I'd love to hear how you'd address clients that may be burping on the table. Raise your hand if you've ever seen a client burping on the table. Yeah. So this is actually another really common one. It's in the same classification as any of these other physiological experiences we had, because one of the sympathetic nervous system responses is for digestion to slow or even stop completely. And when that happens, depending on whatever was going on in the digestive system before that, we can see a sudden shift in the kind of gastrointestinal pressures, and it can cause all kinds of reactions like that. I used to have a client actually who had specifically experienced a trauma from a wellness practitioner, and essentially every time a session would begin, this client would experience extreme nausea, a lot of burping, digestion would shut down completely, and once or twice they would vomit. And I knew this, they knew that I knew, we all were on the same page, and so the way we went forward with this was kind of, okay, we let that happen, and of course the client gets to dictate at all times what happens next. And sometimes that is the session stops. We don't want to do this today, and that does happen occasionally. But yeah, but just know that if you're seeing the burping, what that reflects is the digestive process shutting down. And so it's nothing more alarming than that. But it is a sign that you are entering or that you're dealing with potentially a trauma situation. You know, actually, one thing I'll add to that now that I think about it, there is, as I was saying before, when we see somebody having an experience that looks big or looks uncomfortable, often our initial reaction is to make them more comfortable. And that's a good instinct. Go with that. But is it possible to have, and I used curiosity before, is it possible to have a pause for curiosity even before and now I'd like to make you more comfortable? So if someone, for instance, is burping on the table, and so, you know, me knowing what I know and say, oh, okay, they may be entering a sympathetic nervous system state, or at the very least, their digestion is responding to this process. I might ask a few questions about it. Hey, has this ever happened before? You know, what does it feel like in your belly? Do you feel numb? I might probe the situation a little bit. And then once we've had a chance to talk or explore, then I might say, would you be more comfortable on your side? Would you, you know, are you cold? Are you warm? Right? But I love to insert a little pause where essentially what I'm saying is, I see that what you're feeling may be uncomfortable, but I don't want to ironically take that away from you just yet. I'll help you be more comfortable if that's what you want. But think it's just a little bit presumptuous, isn't it, to assume right away that what they want is to be more comfortable. I have found in this work that people sometimes want to protect their discomforts. It's not my job to say you shouldn't feel this way. It's my job to make it possible for them not to feel this way if they want, but that's up to them. Does that make sense?
Kristen has her hands up.
Kirsten, you are unmuted.
Okay, hi. Yes, I wondered if you recommended, you know, when you're first noticing something and in that curiosity phase, do you, you know, say they're face down on the table and you're noticing a physiological reaction, do you recommend kind of moving into a face-to-face position in order to unpack curiosity, or do you try and stay with them in the position they're in before moving into whatever then they decide they want?
So this is going to be highly variable.
Sure.
For my work, I find that facial contact and facial expression for me is enormously important. I would find it difficult to work without it. But that being said, you know, I'm not a massage therapist. And so I imagine that if you have an expertise that you've built up, feeling and exploring bodies where they are largely face down on the table, you've probably gotten good at that in a way that I haven't. And so I'm gonna put it back on the practitioner. Matter of fact, let's all do a game together. I would like everybody to think of a moment when you had a client on the table and you were kind of doing your thing and you felt something in their body that was interesting to you. It was either unusual or not something you'd ever seen before, or something familiar in your own body, or whatever. But there was something about this session with this person that made you go, that's interesting. So take like 10 quiet seconds, and I want everybody to think of just one specific moment where that happened. Okay. So just quick, by a show of hands, raise your hand if you're thinking of one. You know exactly which session qualifies as that experience. Okay. So now the next thing I want you to do is close your eyes if you want. And there you are with this client who is exhibiting something interesting to you. And you want to find out more about what's going on with this client. when you imagine yourself searching for more information about this client, in your imagination, what is the next thing that you do? Now, don't answer yet, just think about it. Just literally imagine it. What is the next thing that you do if you want more? You want to know more. So we're gonna do this by show of hands, and you can either show hands on your video or you can raise your little blue hand on the screen. But I'm gonna ask questions about what you just visualized, kind of yes or no questions. Just raise your hand if it's yes. So raise your hand if the next thing you did was verbal, a question asked, a statement made, something like that. Okay. Raise your hand if what you did in your imagination was stillness, pausing, doing nothing. Yeah, that's a good one too. Raise your hand if it was positional, changing the client's position or asking the client to change position. And then raise your hand if it was positional for you, where you changed position in terms of where you were touching or where you were standing. Yeah. So, and I have no doubt that any of those things would serve that purpose. Actually, in my apprenticeship program, as part of our level 1 training, we do an exercise where we do a kind of hands-on exercise, and we practice this kind of intentionless touching, which we're actually going to do here in a little bit. We practice intentionless touching, and then we kind of do a flow using intentionless touch to create forward momentum that we don't necessarily expect to happen. It's a neat exercise. Actually, are any of my apprentices here today?
Anne is here.
Oh yeah, Anne is here. Okay. But anyway, so yeah, being curious can take many forms. And so while I might have the form that works for me, I think if there's one thing I trust a massage therapist with, it's physical intuition. And I would encourage you to follow your own physical intuition. Okay, we got a bunch of...
We had an anonymous comment that energetic work is also a factor in that.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah. Okay, let's see. Introduce the concept of the window of tolerance, helping clients stay within it so they don't get overwhelmed. That's going to be a little bit more in the next one, right? So Felix, we are going to talk about window of tolerance a little bit, but for today, that's not, we're not going to go too much into that. Stillness, what else do we have here? Was going to question about the comment on the overall question. Excellent. So Heidi asked, what do you do to show curiosity? Heidi, do you mean me personally, or do you mean anybody? What does one do to show curiosity? Heidi, Heidi, you're unmuted.
Oh, I was curious about what you do.
What I do. So as you may have noticed, I'm very verbal. And so I like to ask a lot of questions. And I have a few questions that I find are the most kind of powerful for being able to get at the heart of an experience. And actually, I'll tell you what, I'm going to push pause on that question for a second, because I do want to show a few slides that I think will help with this next bit. So Heidi, if I forget, make me come back to it, but we're going to push pause on that. That was the wrong thing to do. Hold on one moment. I'm going to share my screen. All right. Can everybody see that okay?
Yes.
Excellent. Hold on. One more thing I have to do. There we go. Okay. So now we're going to look at some of where the rubber meets the road, right? Some of the mechanisms of how to use this knowledge in real time. And obviously with I do a whole 20-hour course just on this one thing. So this is going to be a very pared down version of this. But what I want to start with is a physiological sensation. A physiological sensation. So we had that whole list of things that happened as part of our sympathetic nervous system response, which, like I said, was not comprehensive at all. But it is important, I think, to always be able to bring a conversation back to a physical experience. So, my heart is racing is a statement of physiological experience. And in fact, I'd like everyone to pause just for a moment and think of the last time that you felt your heart racing. When was the last time you noticed your heart racing? And again, don't answer or anything, just think about it for a second. Now, my heart is racing is an interesting statement, because while everyone thinks back to the last time their heart was racing, there may be all kinds of reasons why that happened. So my heart is racing is a different statement entirely than my heart is racing because. And that because can be all kinds of things and all kinds of different emotional textures. Right? Our heart can race with fear, with pleasure, with excitement, with whatever. With firefighters. Izara was excited about that. We had a big laugh last night when she saw me put that slide in. Actually, funny side story. She actually came in the office while I was throwing some slides together, and I had just typed in the Google search term "sexy firefighter" because I wanted to include this. So she comes in my office, and I've got a screen full of sexy firefighters, and she's like, Kev?
Babe? Something you want to tell me?
It's not what it looks like. But anyway, so this is how we're thinking about this idea of there is the physiological experience, and then there's the story that I tell about it. And somewhat famously, there was a research paper done where subjects were asked to walk across a bridge, like a high bridge. And on the other end of the bridge, there is a researcher, and it's set up so that the researcher is chosen to be kind of like sexually compatible with the participants. And the researcher asks a series of kind of ruse questions, red herring questions about their walking across this rickety bridge. And then at the end of it, the researcher gives out their phone number. Well, if you have any questions about this, call me. And then the control group doesn't walk across a rickety bridge. They walk across a much more secure hallway to get to the researcher. And what they found was that the participants that had walked across the rickety bridge were vastly more likely to call the researcher. And it was found that it's called the misattribution of arousal. Raise your hand if you've ever heard that term, misattribution of arousal. Right? So this is where the brain experienced this flushing, this heart racing, this big physiological event. But the brain didn't really know if it felt that because of the bridge or because of the attractive researcher. And that confusion means that more people are willing to attribute their physiological sensation to the person standing in front of them than the bridge they just walked over, right? We don't actually know why we feel a lot of the things that we feel a lot of the time. First of all, conceptually, does that make sense to everybody? I feel like this is a profoundly important idea when it comes to human behavior. And so my heart is racing is a statement of a thing that's happening. But the minute I start going into because, not that that's not invalid, that's useful, that's interesting, that's validating, but from a therapeutic context of limited usefulness. I'm much more interested in what am I feeling? And my heart is racing. The other thing that's interesting about it, you know, when I can tell a because story, my heart is racing because of a scary movie I just watched. I might even leave out the my heart is racing part, and I can maybe tell somebody, wow, I just watched the scariest movie. In which case, in one sentence, what I have done is justified the way that I feel without actually having to say it. Because the statement, my heart is racing, and here's the big thing, is inherently vulnerable. Any statement, any out loud statement, any embodied, visible, conspicuous feeling is vulnerable. And if we're going to have a therapeutic space that serves everyone, the whole diversity of people, from either whether it's from a cultural standpoint, from a experience of trauma standpoint, age, race, sex, whatever, we need to have spaces where the vulnerability associated with feeling is acceptable. Because that's a threat. That's a threatening thing to feel. All of it is. So we have this thing that we do in my program. Well, actually, hold on. I see we have a question, so I'm going to back up. I should. You know, Azara's always trying to get me to pause and like stop talking for a second to just let people digest, and I'm just terrible at that. So let me just take a look at what we got here. Okay, so asking to repeat this idea that any out loud, you know, when I give my narrative about why I feel a certain way, I am essentially justifying that I feel a certain way. I'm giving the reason, right? Because we assume that if how about this? Oh, here's a fun one. Raise your hand if you have ever been accused of being too sensitive.
All the hands go.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, exactly. Because feeling something and then the reasons why I feel something occupy very different places in our kind of social framework as well. And when I have to frequently provide the reasons why I feel something, there's this kind of inherent thing that happens where it wouldn't be okay to just feel it. That feeling it by itself would be unacceptable, irresponsible. It means there's something wrong with you. But what we now know about human behavior, and again, especially looking at trauma, is that when an important event happens to you, or a traumatizing event happens to you, in a very real, concrete way, physiologically, part of you keeps experiencing that. Part of you stays there physically in that state. And it gets amalgamated with all the other parts of you that evolve as you go forward. But there's always part of you that was there. And it means that if you had to drop into a shutdown state, part of you still feels the way that you felt then. That's not being too sensitive, that's just how humans are. And so when we're in therapeutic space, and particularly helping people navigate feeling, I don't want to get bogged down in people feeling like they need to justify why they feel a certain way to me, or even frankly that it's that important to me. I am fascinated by and here for whatever is happening on my table. I'm here to feel it. Not here to provide context for it or to demand context for it. Does that make sense? There's a time for that. Telling our stories is important. Telling our stories is really important. Having our stories validated is really important. As step 2. As step 2. Anything, I see someone here has their hand up. It just says Galaxy S10. I don't know who that is. I'm going to unmute you. So person I just unmuted whose name looks like Galaxy S10, did you have a question? Looks like we don't know who that is. Okay, never mind. I'm going to go back and mute them. All right, anything else before we go any further? Oh, Heidi, now's a good time to come back to your question. Remind me of your question. Where's Heidi?
It was how do you personally?
Oh, how do I show curiosity? That's right. So here are a couple of, I'm going to give you the verbal stuff, right? So here are a couple phrases that I like to use that I find extremely useful for opening the door to a conversation about feeling. First of all, when someone tells me that something has happened to them, it was really frustrating when, God, what's a good example? I'm suddenly blanking on a really good example. It's like
I couldn't go to work today because of the coronavirus.
So yes, let's use some topical ones. So I was really frustrated because I wanted to get back to work, but because of the governor's order, I couldn't get back to work, and it makes me feel really angry and upset that I can't do this. So my initial question to something like that is like, okay, angry, upset, frustrated. What does that feel like? What does angry feel like? And sometimes there's a process there. Well, they'll want to say something like, "Oh, well, you know, it's like that feeling when you're feeling helpless." And I'm like, "Okay, cool." And then here's a tactic I often use. I will tell them what they just said to me. I'll tell them what they just told me. Okay, you just told me it feels like being helpless, but telling me it feels helpless is an idea. You just gave me an idea. Helpless is an idea. I still don't understand what that physically feels like. I don't understand. I use that phrase a lot. I don't understand what this feels like. Can you help me? Can you help me understand what this feels like? I like to put it back on me because that's the truth, right? They're explaining it in a way that makes perfect sense to them. I don't get it. You say, "Oh, it's like when you feel helpless." I'm like, "Okay, but I don't know what that feels like to you." And then, and this is my favorite one, guys, my absolute favorite one. This is my big gun. If they're having a hard time finding that physical feeling, I will use the phrase, "Okay, if you had to do something to my body right now to make me feel the way that you feel, what would you have to do to me? What would you have to do to me to make me feel like how you feel?" And I'll often put in there, be creative, right? No limits. And this can be a useful way for me to start understanding what's going on in their body. Now, I see we just got a very useful question from Liz. We would do this in a massage session, I imagine her saying incredulously. And so the answer to that is, I don't know, would you? I mean, maybe not. But Heidi asked me, what do I do to show curiosity? And so these are my tactics for showing curiosity. I like to come up with little verbal games that encourage people to start applying words to their physical experiences. And this allows me to say, this is where I'm going to zero in. Right? Because it's particularly difficult when someone coming in with a lot of pain. Again, we're going to talk more about pain next time. But if someone comes in, I mean, raise your hand if the reason someone comes to you for your sessions most of the time is pain. Yeah, we see a lot of people in pain. Okay, so when somebody comes in with pain, I know that pain is an incredibly complicated neurological and physiological process. And understanding what pain means is often really challenging. And it's a soup that I don't necessarily want to get mixed up in if I don't have to. So someone can tell me that an area of the body hurts, but that doesn't necessarily tell me where I want to go to work. But if I can get them to explain to me a little bit about how their body feels outside of the pain description, and this is where my curious phrases come in, right? If you were going to make my body feel the way your body feels, what would you have to do? Let's say it was something painful. Here's one that came up recently. I would tie a belt around your forearm and then tighten it all the way. And you're right, that does sound painful. But even just getting them to describe it in that way, I mean, how about this? Raise your hand if when I said, put a belt around your forearm and tighten it, that you got a reaction to that when I said that. Yeah, that feels like something, and not just pain. There's a reaction to having that done to you that feels like something. And that's where I like to go to work. All right, so let's see, let's put the question. In general today, it seems we're using the same word, feelings, for both physical sensations and emotions. Is this correct? Should we have two specific and different terms? I love this question. So on the one hand, we could argue that it would be appropriate to have different words to describe a feeling like a pinprick, or like a pinch, or like an abrasion or an impact, versus a feeling like angry or sad or joyful. So that there's an argument to be made for that. However, I'm going to suggest essentially the opposite argument, which is that your nervous system doesn't differentiate between the way that sad feels and the way that being punched in the gut feels. That the word feeling, I think part of the reason why we get stuck using the same word all the time is because in a very real neurological way, they aren't actually that different. In fact, has anyone read the book How Emotions Are Made by Elizabeth Feldman Barrett? For those interested in exploring this more, that would be a really great text. It's very accessible. It's not super dense, but it's a very smart read. Do we have a copy here? Yeah, looks like that.
I'll put it in the notes too.
Yeah, we can put it in the notes. Because one of the things that she argues for is what's called a constructionist model of human emotion, which is that we use emotion words because they are shorthands, they are ideas, right? And anger and fear and sadness, those are ideas. But it is impossible to imagine actually having the emotion without it physically feeling like something. And that when we feel emotions, what we're really talking about is physiological experiences. And that we build them fresh every time. And there is no fingerprint, as the author says, for sad. Sad doesn't always feel the same way. We take something happening in our body, and every single time these things happen, the brain decides freshly every time, this is sad, this is angry. And it can vary wildly from culture to culture, from geographic location to location, from moment to moment within a person. So very, very cool book if you're interested in exploring that more. So now I want to address a little bit more because as Liz asked so incredulously, would we do this in a massage session? Let's look at how this might dovetail with a massage session, okay? So I want to talk a bit about something. Hold on, I'm going to get my slides back up here. She says, I wasn't being incredulous, it was a sincere question. Thank you, Liz. I'm mostly teasing a little bit. No, I definitely didn't take any offense. Okay, here we go. I'm going to share my screen. Back to here. Okay, everybody see that all right? All right, excellent. Okay, so as I said, in my program, we do some touch practice. And I just call it the sensing touch. And what identifies a sensing touch are these three words, or these three ideas I have down below. First of all, that it is intentionless. That the first time that I touch someone in session, and then multiple times throughout, the goal of that touch is purely connection or communication. That I do not initially touch in order to do anything. And this is where that curiosity idea comes from. So as an example of that, let's all just do a little experiment. I would like everyone to take their right hand, and I want you to look down at your left arm And the goal is, in a moment, you're going to push on your left arm with your right hand, with a finger or multiple fingers, it's up to you. But you're going to push with the specific intent of pushing hard enough to see a little white fingerprint, right? To push the blood and the capillaries away just long enough to get a white fingerprint. So I want you to go down there and I want you to push hard enough that you see a little white fingerprint happen. Good. Do that on a couple more spots. So you're specifically just trying to get a white fingerprint to appear. Do that a few times. All right. Try it now with multiple fingers, right? Get all four non-thumb fingers into it. See if you can get 4 indents. Okay. So that would be a quick example of an intentional touch. I'm touching with the express purpose of doing a thing. There's a time and a place for that, but I'm going to suggest that something more interesting might happen when we don't do that at first. Now, in a moment here, I'm going to have you touch your own arm again. For this, I'm going to suggest that you close your eyes. And what I want you to do is you're going to take your right hand once again, and you're going to place it on your left arm, anywhere you want. And you are going to, the only goal, if you will, is to be able to learn something about your left arm. The goal of this is that after you put your right hand on your left arm, you're going to notice something. A sensation in your right hand, a contour, a temperature, but you're going to put your right hand on your left arm and you're going to notice something about your left arm. Take 15 seconds. Now, first of all, just for the sake of following this through, did anyone notice anything interesting that they want to share? Did anyone have an observation about their own left arm that they think is worth sharing? Okay, actually, I see Daniel over there. Daniel, what do you got? I've unmuted you.
This may not be maybe where your question is going, but I noticed my left arm saying, huh, I'm noticing the quality of the touch you're bringing to me. Okay, I love this. Actually, that you're a couple steps ahead of me, but you're absolutely right. That is a noticeable thing, right? Living tissue being touched can tell how it is being touched. Absolutely, absolutely. Looks like we got a couple other things coming up here. Warmer than I expected. Tendon seemed tender. Okay. I myself, because I had my hand like this, and I happened to notice that there was a flat side and a round side, and I was kind of fixated on the geometry of one side feeling flat and one side feeling round. Now, these in themselves are not hugely exciting observations. But as Daniel pointed out, where we're going with this is that when I touch without the intention of doing anything, matter of fact, let's put it this way. Would you agree that the way you touched your left arm was different when you were making a fingerprint versus when you were learning something? That's really just what we're driving toward. And that this is a skill that can be practiced. Oh, and actually someone else just said, my hand is cold, so my arm just felt cold compared to my right arm. So the coldness of the hand, cooling down the arm. Actually, that brings up another interesting idea, that what I bring with my touch affects the thing that I'm touching. And it does take a particular thought process to try to weed out the noise that you bring, right? And to get the signal that comes from the thing that's being touched. So that actually brings me to my next point. Let me go back to a screen share. But the other important thing about sensing touch is that it is bidirectional. Bidirectional. That when we apply a sensing touch,
we deliver information at roughly the same rate that we receive it. And I think this is important. In fact, it's a valuable tool that we can leverage. I can use my hands as kind of tools, right? If anyone here ever use like Graston tools or any of those other kind of like metal or wooden tools for doing like scraping or fascia release, things like that, right? Being touched with one of those is different than being touched with a hand. Not better or worse, that's not what I'm suggesting. Just that when I know I've got a nervous system attached to one of those things, I can leverage that. I can actually intend to communicate with my sensing touch. And then, as all of you, I'm sure, are extremely aware, our touch is a form of nonverbal communication. That where we touch and the strength with which we touch and the hand position and shape is going to communicate something to the person that you're touching. That is not a question of whether or not. It is definitely going to. So it's just a question of how much control do I have over what's being communicated. So I would like to ask this question. So everyone can see this picture of a couple of my apprentices doing this touch practice here on the screen, yeah? So type in the chat box for me the person standing with the hand on the belly, right? The person with the hand on the upper belly. Just go ahead and intuit. What do you feel like they're saying with that hand?
With their hand on the belly?
Yeah. So the person who's doing the touching, who's got the hand on the belly, what are they communicating to that other person? Just allow yourself to come up with something. What do you think? Seeing a lot of great things here. I've got you. That's a great one. Trust, calmness, acceptance, receiving. I'm here with you. Support, listening, checking in, curiosity, safety. What's going on in there? I love that one. What's going on in there? I'm interested in you. Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. We have a lot of inherent ability to communicate with our bodies. And it's not hard. It involves setting the idea of what you want to communicate and then put your hands on. And this is why it's so important to understand the bidirectional nature of this touch, because you're going to bring yourself to every session. And you are going to be different than the person on the table. And in particular, if there is a privilege disparity, if there is a language disparity, if there is a trauma disparity between you and the person on the table, you may find that story-wise, narrative-wise, there can be an enormous gulf. And so we have to rely on some of the only things that we have in common, which is we all have an internal world that operates on the same mechanisms. And we have to be able to explore the curiosity about that. So let's talk a little bit more about some of the elements of sensing touch before we get to our last practice. What I'd like everyone to do, close your eyes for a moment. We're all going to do a little body scan. So eyes closed, just kind of hanging out where you are. I want you to, as we talked about before, just quickly do a little 2-column assessment of how your body feels right now. And those 2 columns are, first, musculoskeletal sensation, right? So that's effort, fatigue, stretch, work, anything that your muscles might do, or impulse to action. And then that second column is visceral sensation, heart, lungs, stomach, intestines, throat, mouth, skin. Because we know intellectually that your body is producing millions of signals all the time. So right now, Can you pick out one thing to put in both categories? Something you can feel right now that goes in both categories. You don't have to type or share or say, just think about it. Take 15 quiet seconds. Now, I would like you to choose a part of your body that you are going to put one of your hands on. You're going to do this in order to find out more about one of the sensations that you just identified. You just picked out, hopefully, 2 things that you can feel, and you'd like to know more, and you're going to use your hand to learn it. So, pick a spot and put your hand on that spot. Take 10 or 15 seconds to do absolutely nothing. Play a little bit with how your hand that is touching can feel the tissue underneath, and the tissue that you're touching can also feel the hand. Take a specific 15 seconds now to try to separate those 2 sensations into 2 columns. Here are the things that my hand feels about the tissue. Here are the things that my tissue feels about the hand. That might be harder than it sounds. Just take a second. Now, let's talk about the mechanics a little bit. As you feel this area with your hand, I want you to notice the pressure. And to notice, what we're going to do is I want you to push slightly harder first, and then slightly less. And I want you just to now kind of like seesaw between a slightly harder push and a slightly softer push. And here's what you're looking for. You're looking for the moment when, as you increase pressure or decrease pressure, that the pressure that you are pushing into that tissue is, you can feel that, as well as you can feel the kind of interstitial pressure of the tissue pushing back against you. Your fingers, and I don't have to tell you guys this, your fingers and hands are some of the most sensitive parts of your body. You can notice extremely minuscule changes. So the pressure of the tissue underneath of you, if you put a little bit of pressure on, make little divots in the skin, it will push back against you. Can you feel that happening? Okay, take a break. Now, I'm gonna stop the screen share for a second. So first of all, any first impressions of that exercise anybody would like to share? Something about that was interesting to them, unusual, unexpected. Looks like Rosa has something. Yes, Rosa, go ahead.
So when you suggested feeling your skin push back, I actually felt my skin push back against my hand. It was pretty startling to notice that.
Okay. I have felt that before too. Yeah. Thank you, Rosa. Looks like Jessie has a comment. Jessie, you are unmuted.
Yeah, hi. The same aspect of that, the pushing and feeling the body push back. It's kind of how I approach deep tissue work, in that we have to figure out how much resistance that tissue has in its trigger point or locked up aspect and meet it with the same amount of resistance plus just a little bit more to get it to go back to an extended and relaxed state. So that came to mind for me.
Excellent. Excellent. Thank you. And then we have one person that says, I noticed that I enjoyed the touch. When you had us increase the pressure, I noticed I had an emotional reaction of stress, worry, or fear. Yeah, so, you know, to go back to what Jesse was just saying, that there can be a negotiation with that pressure. And part of that negotiation is to help create a release. That's one section. The other section is that, you know, as Daniel pointed out, I can feel when I'm being sensed. I can also feel when I'm being manipulated. Now, I don't mean that in a negative sense, right? But there is something enjoyable, there's something pleasant about a touch where I feel that there is two-way connection. And if that connection is being overcome, there is something unpleasant about that, or at least can be. Let me ask this question to the group. Raise your hand if you did not like that experiment, if that was uncomfortable. I saw some faces, so I know that it wasn't comfortable for everybody. Yeah, that's normal too. That's normal too. Because in a way, because again, how this, you didn't come here for a massage, so there was no kind of initial acceptance of vulnerability. And essentially what I just asked you to do was engage in something a little vulnerable. Does that make sense? And so if that's not what you were prepared for, you may have had a little reaction of like, nope, don't like this.
I wanted to say, I've noticed how not a massage therapist I am in the last, you know, couple classes. When I put my hand on my shoulder, I've had some shoulder pain recently, and I was noticing how I was thinking about the kind of closed loop of like touching and being touched in both directions, but I couldn't stop thinking about my dominant hand doing all the work. Like this is the agent and this is the acted upon, right? This is the doer and this is the thing, having the thing done to it. The reverse, it was like this, my brain would just shut off whenever I tried to do that. And I imagine as LMTs, you probably were like, God, it's so easy, but super isn't.
Okay, a couple more questions here. So let me go to the chat box first. Okay, listen, so, actually, this is a great one. It's interesting, in this touch/social starved time, to receive my own touch with the same emotional response as if it were someone else. Did anybody else experience anything like that? Where it almost felt like an other, that there was a sensation of an other? So this is actually a skill that can be honed. And in fact, I did a course, an emergency course a little while ago, a 4-part course helping people move wellness practices online. And we used this about being able to we can get way more into hemispheric dominant stuff on another day, but being able to understand that there are two of us in here. There are two hemispheres and they control the body like independent people. And that with a certain amount of somatic practice, we can experience a kind of otherness, and that can be a boon. That can be leveraged for good. So that's cool. I'm glad you were able to feel something like that. And then let's go to some raised hands. Akemi had something. Akemi, go right ahead.
Okay, so I noticed when we started it that I didn't know this, but as I was touching my sacrum, I felt initially like my body was telling me, no, that's not the correct angle. I don't really like that. So repositioning and then like, okay, there it is. I felt like this response back of almost like that otherness of like initially like, no, let's not do this because you're just going to open up a whole lot of other crap that we don't have time for. Just move on, right? But then as the touch progressed, is like, okay, well, if you're going to do that, then do this, and just repositioning. And then it was like, great. Okay, now let's talk.
Great. Okay, so what you're describing here is a term that I use all the time in practice: negotiation. Right? This is a negotiation of vulnerability. And it can happen so quick, right? An immediate response of like, nope, that's not quite what feels good or right here.
And if you are in that bidirectional sensing touch, I know we're touching ourselves right now, so it feels like you have all the info, but there's enough of an otherness there that I am confident, you know, when I teach this to my apprentices, that this kind of practicing this kind of sensing touch, you will be amazed how quickly you are aware that, oop, this is not right. This is not the right touch for right now. They may have come into my office in order to have me help them feel or to give them a feeling, but this is not what they're looking for. Maybe this will be what they're looking for. Which actually brings up just one more little point I want to make. There's nothing wrong with taking your intuition to make an assumption, which is what we've all just done, right? When I asked you to pick a part of your body to touch, you had to use your intuition to make an assumption. And as Akemi pointed out, that an original assumption often needs to be modified. And the goal is, when you make your initial assumption about what a client might need or what they might want, you have taken all the available data and made your best judgment. You might need to modify it quickly. That's normal, right? If your initial impression was misguided, incorrect, or needs modification, there's nothing harmful to you about that. It doesn't mean you did anything wrong. And in fact, the more you get used to making assumptions and then course correcting, the better you get at using your intuition for those kind of processes. And let's see, here's, oh, and then what was your goal with having to identify a feeling that was matched both musculoskeletal and emotional? So I think it's important for people to understand that these things are different. And it kind of goes back to the one original things people were saying, that you can have someone on the table who starts to shake and cry. Now, maybe they have done enough massage sessions that they expect that might happen sometimes. Maybe they know that's a thing that's possible. Maybe they don't. Maybe this might happen and it was a total surprise to them. Has anybody ever had a massage where somebody had an emotional reaction and was surprised by their own emotional reaction? Yeah, because we don't know, right? So much, guys, so much of our wellness is outsourced to other people. We don't know some of these basic ideas. My musculoskeletal system and my visceral system are not felt the same way. Most people don't even know that. And so to be experiencing a physical touch from a manual practitioner and to suddenly start quaking might seem crazy. And so, I mean, it isn't. It's perfectly normal. And I think that even for us as practitioners, we're still human. We still compartmentalize just like our clients do. And being able to see how that process of musculoskeletal versus visceral interacts with each other in ourselves will make it easier to navigate and be compassionate for in our clients.
I think this goes back to the notion of the sensation and then the story about the sensation. Mm-hmm. And that the sensation happens whether there's a story attached to it or not. You know, you are quaking. Why you are quaking is a narrative that you kind of build in the moment, and there, you know, truth or fiction is kind of irrelevant, right? It's what you believe, and your belief kind of makes it true, right? But I think it's where you're kind of putting it back into practical context now. As we go back to work, there's going to be a lot of storytelling about, like, well, that's over, that's done, on with my life. It's like, no, we are all deeply traumatized. Like, this is not business as usual. It will not feel like business as usual on either end. And
okay.
just being aware of that is a good.
I realize it's 12 o'clock. I'm going to cut you off, but I have just one more quick thing that I want to show you. It was one last little slide. I almost was on time. Because just to leave you with one kind of practical thing, one of the things that I find very useful when it comes to people, like observing people's traumatic responses, is breath holding. And part of the reason why sensing touch I think is really valuable is because I want to be able to catch things that may be happening that otherwise I wouldn't notice. And breath holding is one that is easy to catch if you're looking for it. And especially if I have the sense that this might be a person with a trauma background, I'm looking for breath holding. It's really useful because it's largely involuntary. If threat goes up and someone starts to hold their breath, they can they often don't even know they're doing it. And therefore it's a signal that even if they're trying to like play it cool for me, I'll know that's happening. Signifies that threat. And again, this is also kind of a tricky one, especially when we're talking about navigating privilege disparities, that someone's walked into your office and has, you know, granted you consent to give them a massage, right? They've said yes to giving them a massage. But if I'm going through a manual practice and I find that they keep holding their breath, that tells me that they've said yes, but somebody in there doesn't like this. And if I want to help navigate that consent in an authentic way, I need to be aware. I need to know when that inner struggle, remember guys, we talked about the inner threat, the one between their parasympathetic and their sympathetic nervous system. Their parasympathetic might say yes, but their sympathetic might be saying no. And I need to know that. I need to be able to have some sense of that so I can continue to position myself in a way that is safe both for me and for my client. And then, as Kami mentioned a second ago, this idea of finding a touch and then needing to shift. Breath holding is a great opportunity for negotiation, because if I notice it happening, I can immediately, either immediately or even after the session, say, I noticed that you were holding your breath a lot. You know, and that gives them a chance to tell me. Because I guess personal story here for a second. I have been through so many massages where I was holding my breath, but I was uncomfortable, and they didn't notice. And I felt weird saying it. This is kind of a personal thing about me. And I actually, on many massages, actually, Zara can attest to this, I get violently nauseous after massages about a third of the time that I get them. And what I have discovered over time is it comes back to I'm holding my breath and they don't notice. And when I do notice that, it means that I have the opportunity to negotiate. I noticed this. Do you need me to do something different? So you're sensing touch, you know, almost anywhere you might be touching along the axial skeleton will give you a sign when breath is held. And that's just one of those things that I'm going to say we should keep at the top of our list of things to look for. So that concludes today's event. Next time, we're going to be following up with a little bit more discussion about pain. So exactly how pain relates to trauma and threat and how it happens in the nervous system. It's a fascinating topic. It's one of my favorite things to talk about. And then we'll also go into a little bit more of the kind of hemispheric dominant stuff, how the dominant versus the non-dominant side of the body process these things differently and how that can be navigable for you as a practitioner. Does anybody have any kind of last questions, anything that they really needed to hear or really needed to say? You're welcome to everybody saying thank you. It was my pleasure.
If it feels like you were drinking from the fire hose today, that's okay. He gets that a lot. Don't be shy about asking questions to him or to me in any manner you feel comfortable. You've got our emails. I recognize that this is extremely esoteric, complicated stuff. But I think it's eminently applicable to massage practice when you know what you're looking for. So. Okay, well, and I did record this, and the recording is being made available for people. Yeah, so the recording of all of this will be available if you want to revisit it. So know that that is on the table. Okay. Goodbye, everybody. Thank you for coming. Thanks, everybody.